Hello and welcome to the History of Bangalore. I am Ramjee Chandran, here with episode 111 of season 3. Let's see where we left off. In the last episode, we were with Tipu Sultan in Travancore, following the chain of events that gave Cornwallis the war that he had been waiting for. Tipu's campaign in Malabar and his attack on Travancore was the trigger that Cornwallis was looking for. And I left you at the point where the most dangerous coalition that Mysore had ever faced was taking place, the Marathas, the Nizam of Hyderabad, and the British, all spoiling to attack Bangalore. The man who would be in charge of the attack on Bangalore was Charles Cornwallis. Here in India, after his disaster in the United States, where he lost the American War of Independence. And now what drove him to take personal command of this particular campaign? With what conviction did he think that he could fix it? This is what we will be looking at today. But before I do, first as always, a word of thanks to my sponsors, the Prestige Group, for their corporate support. They make this podcast possible. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. Charles Cornwallis invaded Bengaluru. That's his entry into the history of this city. One line. But behind that line is a story of defeat, humiliation, and a man who spent a decade trying to claw back something that no administrative reform could restore. Only a war could do that. So to understand why Cornwallis came here, we need to step back a little bit, back to the 19th of October 1781, a small town on the banks of the York River in Virginia. Yorktown was the last major battle of the American Revolutionary War, the War of Independence. George Washington and the French had encircled the British position. They tightened the noose for weeks. But when the end came, Cornwallis didn't even show up. He claimed illness and sent a subordinate, a General Charles O'Hara, to hand over the sword of surrender. Now, whether he was genuinely sick, or whether he simply couldn't bring himself to perform that particular humiliation in person, history has never settled. What history has settled very quickly was the verdict. He was the man who lost the American colonies. He was the general who handed Washington his greatest victory. And he was the face of British national disgrace. Now here's the irony. It connects directly to Bangalore. You'll remember from an earlier episode that Hyder Ali had become something of a hero in America, a man from Mysore who had been tormenting the British in India while the colonists in America were fighting them on the Atlantic seaboard. At those victory celebrations in Trenton, New Jersey, 13 toasts were raised, and toast number 11, ironically, was to Hyder Ali. And now a decade later, Cornwallis was in Hyder's kingdom, marching through the territory that Hyder had built, ready to fight Hyder's son Tipu Sultan. History occasionally arranges itself with an almost suspicious sense of irony, doesn't it? For most generals, Yorktown would have been the end of their career. But this was late 18th century Britain. Aristocratic lineage, parliamentary concession, and a reputation for personal rectitude could cushion falls that would have finished men of a lesser station. Cornwallis had all three. He was made a Knight of the Garter. He was elevated to the position of an Earl. And then he spent the years, following his humiliation in America, building something more durable than rank. He built a reputation for being incorruptible. He became, in fact, a persistent headache for the Prince of Wales, who was the future King George IV. This prince ran a court of spectacular financial irresponsibility, and he kept coming to Cornwallis with requests for what his contemporaries called infamous and unjustifiable jobs. And these were holding places for favorites, for men who had ruined themselves at the gambling table. To this routine corruption of aristocratic patronage, Cornwallis said no. Every time, inexorably, as the accountants put it, in a world where such requests were simply accommodated as a matter of course, that refusal by Cornwallis itself was a statement. The man who surrendered at Yorktown was making clear that he was not available for a different kind of surrender. By 1786, that reputation was enough. He was sent to India, not as the servant of the East India Company, but something new. The first man to hold the combined offices of Governor-General and Commander-in-Chief. That dual mandate tells you what we need to know about how far the relationship between the Crown and the East India Company had fractured by the 1780s. Prior to that, the post of the Governor-General itself had been created out of the distrust that the British Crown had for the East India Company, for their ability to govern. This led to the William Pitt's India Act of 1784, which placed a board of control staffed by the king's own ministers above the company's directors. Real power was shifting unmistakably. It moved from the headquarters of the East India Company in London into the offices of the Crown. When Cornwallis landed in Madras, he was described at the time as a stout, healthy-looking nobleman of 52. He had a mission, as one account puts it, to evolve order out of chaos. He took that job seriously. In India, he hunted out frauds. He abolished the jobbing agencies through which the East India Company's servants had been enriching themselves for decades. He established what was known as the Whig philosophy of government. This was the principle that the institution was above the men who ran it. The administration, he said, should be bigger than any individual. The rules should apply to everybody. Now, these were not small ideas in a colonial administration that had, until then, operated on very, very different principles. And then there came the permanent settlement of land revenue in Bengal. This was a sweeping reform that fixed land tax permanently and created a class of hereditary landlords. These were the zamindars as we know them. They would hold their estates as long as they paid their fixed assessment to their overlords. Its long-term effects on Bengal's peasantry were damaging in ways that Cornwallis either didn't foresee or chose not to weigh. The zamindars collected from the peasants whatever the market would bear, pocketed the differences between that and the fixed assessment, and had every incentive to squeeze and nothing to invest. Bengal's agrarian economy would carry the consequences of this for many generations. But as a signal that the new Governor-General meant to impose structure on a system that had been running on chaos and personal favors and advantage, it was formidable. This new thing imposed order, it imposed clarity. It was exactly the kind of reform that leaves a permanent mark. There was also something revealing in Cornwallis's broader approach to the Indian administration. He held a firm, and by modern standards, troubling conviction that Indians should be excluded from all senior levels of company government. He believed and said so plainly that an Indian official could not be trusted with the same responsibilities as a European one. Now, this was not some sort of incidental prejudice, it was policy. He codified it. And in doing that, he laid the administration's foundation for a kind of racial hierarchy in colonial government that over the years would harden considerably in the century that followed. Cornwallis's reforms that cleaned up corruption also in the same movement concentrated power in exclusively white European hands. And that is the full picture of what Cornwallis built in Bengal. All of it was real, all of it mattered. None of it restored what Yorktown had taken away from him. Reforming Bengal had put revenue figures in order. It didn't put Cornwallis's reputation in order, not in the way that reputation in the world actually required. What was needed was a battlefield. He had lost a war, he needed to win another, a campaign, a victory that could be seen as named and celebrated in the right places as his. No settlement of land revenue could erase the memory of O'Hara handing over the sword of surrender on his behalf. Cornwallis, though, was not a man given to self-pity, but he was also not a man who could pretend that the ledger had been balanced. His personal ledger had not been balanced. When Tipu Sultan attacked Travancore in December 1789 and handed the British the justification that they needed for war, Cornwallis saw an opportunity that was much more than the treaty violation that he claimed. He saw his moment, and then he assembled a coalition. The armies of all the coalition members, the Nizam of Hyderabad and the Marathas and the British were all available, and the enemy was identifiable. That was Tipu Sultan. Everything that he had been positioning towards 1786 had come into focus, and he also saw with equal clarity that he couldn't or wouldn't hand that moment to anyone else, because Bangalore in 1791 was going to be Cornwallis's moment of resurrection. After the break, the war begins, and almost immediately it starts to go wrong. How did Cornwallis respond? Stay with me to find out when I'll be back right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools, and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals, and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. Radar approved.
The Third Anglo-Mysore War formally opened in May 1790. Operational command on the ground was given to General William Meadows, the governor of Madras and the commander-in-chief of the Madras forces. Charles Cornwallis was still in Calcutta. He authorized Meadows to run the campaign independently, trusting that a well-resourced force with a clear objective would produce a decisive result. What he got instead was a lesson in the limits of that trust. Meadows' design was a 3-pronged strike into Mysore. His own force, 15,000 men assembled at Trichy, would drive through the Gajalhatti Pass into the Coimbatore province in the west. General Abercrombie, commanding from the Bombay Presidency, would hit the Malabar and the Canara coast simultaneously, and then a third column under Colonel Maxwell would invade the Bara Mahal in the northwest of the Carnatic. The logic was encirclement. Simultaneous pressure on Tipu Sultan from 3 directions, forcing Tipu to divide his forces and leave no single front defensible. It was a reasonable plan, but Tipu made it look naive. Meadows marched on the 26th of May 1790, directly into pre-monsoon weather, the kind that punishes armies who are unfamiliar with the terrain. The winds came rushing through the Palghat Gap, pushing continuous rainfall across the Coimbatore approaches, and the path turned slushy, treacherous almost immediately. It took Meadows' army 20 days to cover roughly 80 kilometers. Over 1,000 men fell sick even before they fought anyone. When they finally reached Karur, they found Tipu's troops had long gone. Meadows pressed on into Coimbatore, took the town, and allowed himself that one little moment of satisfaction. But he was not ahead. He was being managed. Tipu had no intention of giving the British the pitched battle that they were looking for. He withdrew to the Mysore plateau, leaving behind a corps of light cavalry under Said Sahib, a mobile, fast, under strict orders to harass British communications and cut their supply lines without ever committing to a decisive engagement. Meadows spent the entire summer of 1790 taking little towns instead. He took Karur, Dharapuram, Coimbatore, Dindigul, one after another. He wasn't yet fighting the Mysore army. He was annexing the geography. The reckoning came in September. Tipu descended from the plateau with 40,000 men. On the 13th of September, his forces struck the British garrison at Satyamangalam. It was being held by a Colonel Floyd, roughly with 2,800 men. Floyd did manage to drive back the first assault. Then a second Mysore division came upon his left flank and pinned him down. Floyd withdrew in the night. He crossed the Bhavani River in coracles, little basket boats, the round ones. And a crossing like that took 4 hours, left his men exhausted and demoralized. Satyamangalam returned to Tipu, and it would stay his until the day that he died. From Satyamangalam, Tipu pressed forward. He didn't want to destroy anything in open battle, but to do exactly what Hyder had taught him to do: maneuver, raid, burn the forage, cut the supply depots, threaten the communication lines, make the British army an occupying force that was defending its own tail rather than an advancing one pressing bravely towards its objective. By October and November 1790, Tipu's cavalry was ranging freely across the entire Carnatic frontier. British garrisons were being pulled back, trying to look for stronger posts. Field operations had slowed to a crawl. The initiative had shifted completely away from Meadows. Cornwallis watched all of this from Calcutta with mounting frustration, and the diagnosis wasn't difficult. Meadows' 3 columns had handed Tipu the one advantage that he didn't want handed to him: interior lines of control. Now, with British forces split along 3 distant axes, Tipu could strike at whichever column was the most exposed before the others could concentrate to support it. And he did precisely that. The British had moved first, but Tipu had used their methods to gain control. Then there were 2 further problems that Cornwallis had identified. The Gujarati Pass was useless as a route for heavy siege artillery. It was too steep, it was too narrow, and the surrounding terrain was perfect for Tipu's light cavalry to harass the bullock trains carrying the guns. And the British army lacked the mobile cavalry to match Tipu's lutees, the fast, irregular raiding horses that Tipu had used to screen his movement and bleed enemy logistics. A young officer, Thomas Munro, writing to his father in December 1790, put the internal British assessment without any diplomatic softening. There was not a single military man in the country, he told his father, who believed that Meadows or any other senior officer were equal to the task at hand. And Cornwallis himself admitted, in a candid moment that Munro also recorded later, that Tipu's lutees were the finest troops in the field, always doing something to harass the enemies, and that without his personal arrival, Tipu would likely have been too much for the generals to handle. By December 1790, Cornwallis came to the conclusion that was inescapable. He couldn't run it from Calcutta. He needed to arrive in Madras and take command himself. He arrived in Madras on the 12th of December 1790 and formally assumed operational command. Meadows stepped aside. The first year of the Third Anglo-Mysore War had demonstrated with complete clarity what dispersed forces and divided command couldn't achieve. Now under Cornwallis, the second phase is going to be different. Instead of taking the southern routes that Tipu's intelligence had anticipated, Cornwallis's army would drive north through the rugged Chittoor district where the Eastern Ghats were giving way to the Mysore plateau. This was the strategic blind spot in Tipu's defensive architecture. It was less guarded, more manageable for heavy artillery, and it would put the British army on the plateau before Tipu could even mount a coordinated response. This sort of flanking maneuver could bypass the scorched earth defense tactics that Tipu had laid all along the expected southern axis. Now the first objective on the plateau was not Srirangapatna, it was Bangalore. We have seen this logic before on this podcast many times. Every serious commander who looked at the geography of the interior of Mysore eventually decided the same conclusion. First take Bangalore, the fortified city on the plateau, the arsenal, the garrison town, and it was the hinge between the Carnatic plain and the Mysore heartland. It was the road to Srirangapatna. Cornwallis had arrived at the same place that Chikkadevaraja had reached almost a century before him. Bangalore first, then Srirangapatna. The British army was assembling, the routes were chosen, and the coalition with the Marathas in Hyderabad was in place. And Cornwallis, the man who had surrendered at Yorktown, who had spent a decade rebuilding what that surrender had cost him, who had reformed Bengal and said no many times to the Prince of Wales, arrived in India as a royal proconsul rather than a company clerk, and he was ready to march. Where Yorktown had locked him down inside a siege which was not of his choosing, the campaign on Bangalore would move at a tempo that Cornwallis intended to control every step of it. In the next episode, I will talk about the diplomatic moves at Pune as we go inside the negotiations that were happening in the Triple Alliance, the desperate counter moves by Tipu's envoys, and the remarkable man who outmaneuvered everyone. That's coming up soon. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the history of Bangalore.